Anger and turbulence over KCI, plus the Jackson County prosecutor, and a bombshell announcement on marijuana. Meanwhile, the new Kansas governor says she's ready to make a deal on pot in her state. And how is bleaching food better than letting homeless people eat it? Kansas City now in the national news spotlight.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, I'm Nick Haynes and thank you for joining us. If this was Sesame Street, we'd be telling you this week's program is brought to you by the letter U. U for update, and there are some remarkable, totally unexpected and head-turning updates to some of the biggest news stories we've been tracking on this program. Rolling up their sleeves and connecting the dots on those stories for us from 41 Action News, reporter Kat Reed, and from KCTV5 News, political reporter Caroline Sweeney. From the pages of your Kansas City Star, editorial writer Toriano Porter, and political analyst, columnist and star opinion writer Dave Helling. It was the former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson who said a week is a long time in politics. That is true of events right here in our metro over the past 7 days, a week after Missouri voters overwhelmingly approve a constitutional amendment legalizing the medical use of marijuana. The Jackson County prosecutor has now announced her office will no longer prosecute any marijuana possession cases, except that is in cases of impaired driving and where the drug leads to harm of a child. It has implications on both sides of state line. But first, why is Jean Peters Baker linking what is a narrow easing of marijuana law to help people with serious illnesses to unilaterally deciding she's not going to prosecute anyone smoking or using pot? Caroline?
Well, I just think you could look outside of the courtroom for this. You know, Jean Peters Baker is very aware of what's been going on with the Jackson County Jail, how fast these are, the beds are filling up, and there's a lot of discussion nationwide about prosecuting marijuana crimes, and I think this may be her way of easing that in the county.
But I see that the Kansas City Police Department this week saying, no, we're still going to follow, Toriano, local, state, and federal laws on this, so you can still be arrested.
That's true, and it's gonna be a really interesting development over the next few months to see how this plays out. I'm all for decriminalizing marijuana. That's just because of the nature of some of the sentencing laws, but I think it was a great play on her part.
What happens now, though, it has implications all across the metropolitan area. What happens, for instance, if you go from Jackson County and you head into Clay County or Platte County, or perhaps even you working in Johnson County, Dave?
You're in trouble. I mean, the policy only applies in Jackson County. If you drive across the bridge and you're carrying marijuana and you're in Clay or Platte County, you can be in serious trouble. They're pretty aggressive about it there, and of course the laws still apply, and the federal government still applies. That's one of the great problems that the entire country is going to have to face, Nick, because when you have such disparate treatment of the same event, the same behavior, it breeds a disrespect for law. It says in some sense, you're not breaking the law in Jackson County, you are in Platte County. That doesn't make sense to people. So one of the messages from the November vote, and votes all across the country, is the attitude toward marijuana is changing. I think Jean Peters Baker understands that, and her announcement was as much political as it was policy.
Will this have more of a domino effect? I also noticed that the governor of Kansas, who really didn't spend an awful lot of time talking about marijuana at all during her campaign, now saying she's going to try and make a deal to at least provide medical marijuana in the state of Kansas.
I think it will. You know, from talking to people who are national experts on the issue of medical marijuana, including one of the leading advocates in Congress, Congressman out from Oregon, he said that Missouri is kind of this last state. He felt as if they could pass medical marijuana, that it could create a domino effect, and many more states will do it.
But you have to look at the discussion that's been had for several years now in Kansas. When Colorado legalized marijuana, there was a huge discussion about what do we do with that Kansas border. And although it didn't come up too much in the debates preceding the election, I think everyone looked at Laura Kelly as the Democratic candidate, that this would be toward the top of her priorities.
Lots of things didn't come up with regards to this prior to the election. One thing we're noticing this week is that if you are getting a medical marijuana certification card from a doctor, you cannot carry a firearm. Now there's concerns also because all of the medical societies were pretty much opposed to medical marijuana being legalized in Missouri, whether you can find a doctor who will actually write you a slip to say you can take this.
Well, my understanding is that it won't be prescribed like a medicine, that you simply obtain the card, the medical marijuana card, and that will entitle you to go into a dispensary and get medical marijuana going forward. So the doctor's involvement is on the front end, and I don't think there will be a big problem in finding some doctors who will give you that permission. But you point out something extraordinarily important and interesting. It's going to take a long time for the state to establish regulations and a system for having medical marijuana, Nick. You know, we don't know, for example, will the state test marijuana to make sure it's efficacious and it does all the things that it says it's going to do? When you go in and buy, you know, what's the THC content? All those questions need to be answered before this gets up and running in the state.
You know, in another election-related development, even though many campaign yard signs have still yet to be taken down, efforts are underway to overturn one of the big statewide issues decided by you at the ballot box. Missouri voters approved a constitutional amendment last week to change state ethics laws and overhaul the way the state's political maps are drawn. Who is now trying to overturn it, and on what basis, Toriano?
It makes no sense. You have to respect the will of the voters, and the voters were loud and clear on Election Day. They want reform in Jeff City.
Well, I think what people are seeing now is the reality of that want, but it's putting this into action. I mean, obviously there were clearly defined things in that Clean Missouri amendment that we now know how it's going to work, but you're seeing some elected officials on both sides of the state line concerned about what the breakdown is going to be because of the population centers in the state.
So the Missouri Chamber of Commerce had expressed a lot of concern about this, and the biggest issue, of course, in Clean Missouri for the opponents is the redistricting aspect. They fear that it would create, you know, more political influence in the process. And you also have an argument from some African-American lawmakers of fear that it could keep them out of office or lead to fewer black representatives.
So how would that actually happen? Why would you see a loss of minority representation because of this law?
Well, I think it goes back to the population centers. You have a big population centers on the east and the west side of the state. You've got kind of Columbia, Jeff City in the middle, but everything else in Missouri is rural, and that's going to cause problems when you're trying to get equal distribution.
But I will point out, when I spoke with the people who worked on Clean Missouri, they said if you look at the amendment itself, the very first thing that they are supposed to consider when looking at these districts is, are they representative racially, and they want to make sure that they are not diluting the voting power of communities of color.
By the way, just because there is a law doesn't mean people will follow it. Missouri voters just approved increasing the state's minimum wage to $12 an hour, but will employers pay it? A Chinese restaurant owner in Johnson County in Kansas just been busted for faking records about paying his workers minimum wage. Yong Lin, owner of the China Garden Buffet at Merriam Town Center near IKEA, has just been sentenced to 10 months in federal prison. I'm assuming this is not an isolated example, though, Caroline.
It's an odd example, and I think it's one that really brings the issue of paying people minimum wage and a livable wage to light, whether or not this was just appropriate timing from the charging agencies after this vote. But every business I've talked to who supports Prop B says they're going to do this if the vote is passed.
Is the editorial board of the Star seeing an exodus of Missouri businesses now because the pay is going to go up to $12 over the next 5 years and heading into Kansas, Toriano?
I don't think so, but what I do think there's concern, and there's always going to be concern, but at the end of the day, people need a livable wage. They need to be able to earn enough money to pay their bills, take care of their children, and eat.
Now, just remember, this is a gradual increase in the minimum wage. It's 85 cents in the first year, starting at the first of the year. Most employers in a low unemployment economy, which we're in, are meeting that or exceeding it already. The $12 thing doesn't take effect until 2023, Nick. I don't think, and there were businesses, by the way, who supported the increase in the minimum wage. So I don't think this is particularly onerous. If people don't pay the higher wage in Missouri, it's because they have something nefarious in mind other than opposition to this increase.
Without one vote being cast, Missouri is getting a new attorney general.
I've just always tried to work as hard as I can, and that's the kind of work ethic I'm going to bring to this office. And I take very seriously the responsibility of being the lawyer for 6 million Missourians.
Governor Mike Parson this week announcing he is appointing State Treasurer Eric Schmidt to replace Josh Hawley as the state's chief law enforcement officer. Remarkably, 4 of the 6 statewide elected officials in Missouri are now appointees. Not one Missourian voted for Mike Parson to be governor. Not one Missourian voted for Mike Kehoe to be lieutenant governor or Eric Schmidt to be attorney general. And shortly, Governor Parson will appoint someone new to fill Eric Schmidt's shoes as state treasurer. Is that unprecedented?
I mean, it is pretty wild to have that many state officials appointed, but I think it's just the domino effect of what we've seen between Governor Eric Greitens, that scandal, and then this is what happens when someone's elected to office.
Does that matter, though, Toriano?
It matters. It matters. At the end of the day, voters have a vote. And like you said, 4 of these 6 people were not voted by the people.
They weren't voted for those offices. The Mike Kehoe appointment was one of the most contentious ones, but you can see what Governor Mike Parson is trying to do. He's looking at who was already trusted by Missouri voters enough to fill a statewide seat, especially with this Eric Schmidt appointment. And he understands that fully because even though he got votes for lieutenant governor, he ran on a separate ticket than Eric Greitens did. And so he had to recognize that voters need to trust him and his decisions somehow.
Just quickly, a little piece of breaking news. I was told this week that there are 2 people on the short list for the appointment to be treasurer in Missouri, Brenda Talent and Bev Randles. Brenda Talent is the wife of former Senator Jim Talent, and Bev Randles ran for lieutenant governor. If she were to be appointed, she would be the first African-American in statewide office in Missouri history, so there is some historic context for that. Both Brenda and Bev are related politically to Rex Sinkfield, and there's an idea that Governor Parson wants to placate the Sinkfield wing of his party so that he doesn't face a primary challenge in 2020, and that's why Randles and Talent are on the short list.
While there have been a number of stories this week celebrating what will now be the most diverse freshman congressional class in history, not so here. In fact, there will be fewer women in the Kansas legislature when lawmakers return in January, not more. Toriano, you did an editorial on this week. I thought we were doing well on the diversity front. For the first time, 2 openly gay candidates elected to the Kansas legislature. Ru Shu from Johnson County also became the first Chinese American serving in the Kansas legislature.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that because our editorials are unsigned. But yeah,
figured it out.
Yeah, doing work on that, I was interested to find out that even though this national movement is taking place in Missouri and both Kansas, those minorities and non-traditional candidates are kind of standing still. That's very concerning. But you know, in Missouri and both Kansas, they need to get a deeper pool of qualified candidates that's able to generate money, revenue, and support.
Now, it was also in the editorial that the bench was thin on the ground in terms of who could move into some of these bigger offices.
Very thin.
But you've just mentioned there, of course, there may be the possibility that we might have a state treasurer who's African-American in the next week.
We'll see. Again, that would be historic in Missouri. There is a feeling, I've said this on the show, it turned out to be inaccurate, that there's never been an African-American Kansas. There was in 1882 a state auditor elected who was African-American, so I'm glad to correct the record. But the reality is statewide in Kansas and Missouri, it's been extraordinarily hard for African Americans or other minorities to ascend to statewide office, in part because of a lack of candidates, apparently, and also because of just the condition of the 2 states. So that would be an extraordinarily important
Well,
signal.
everybody is fixated nationally on some of the big elections like in Florida. We're still waiting to count those votes. What's going to be the result? We actually had some decisions made this week, including a second woman who now has been elected to the Johnson County Commission. There was concerns prior to this election that was a completely white male body. That is going to change as a result of this election.
Yeah, I think it is going to change, and we're seeing in small pockets of the state these changes that Toriano was talking about in his editorial. But what I was finding so fascinating was how proud people were of Kansas with the election of Sharice Davids and Laura Kelly, but they keep forgetting, and we have to remind them, that Laura Kelly is going into a more conservative state legislature. So although they can kind of ride this high of some of these changes that we saw in Kansas, coming up in January, there could be some stalling.
Last week, we dissected the rising price tag of building a new single terminal at KCI. Now there's even more concerning news. Could the entire deal with the city's hand-picked developer now be off?
You know what? I think it's past time to be asking questions. We've been asking questions for years now. The voters answered one important thing for us. It's time for us to start answering things for them.
Kat Reed talking to Quinton Lucas there, the city councilman. 2 discount carriers currently serving KCI say they're not on board with the new look KCI, and local engineering firm Burns & McDonnell claims they've been asked to submit a new price for what they could build the terminal for, and they say they could do it substantially cheaper than the one currently being worked on with developer Edgemoor. But haven't we already decided this issue? Doesn't the city have an agreement to work with Edgemoor on building this new terminal?
Well, they do have a memorandum of understanding, but the development agreement has not yet been signed. Having the airlines,
after all this time?
After all this time, having the airlines sign on is a big part of getting all of that wrapped up. There's an ordinance that includes several different aspects for the terminal. So it hasn't been decided yet, and I think that it is interesting that on November 1st, we had the aviation director go before council and say the airlines have no anxiety at all about this price tag. There's no anxiety, everything's fine. And then we see those letters from Spirit and Allegiant, and I think it's concerning to a lot of people that Southwest was not there on Thursday.
But these are 2 small discount carriers. How seriously is that taken when you do have just some of the smaller concerns being raised? Are they being taken seriously?
Well, you want to respect everyone's position in this, small or large. But my biggest concern with the whole airport fiasco is the lack of transparency and openness, and that's why it's very important in government that we have those things: transparency and openness.
A couple things, Nick. If it were just isolated to the Kansas City airport, I think the concerns of Spirit and Allegiant would be less noticeable, but there are precedents set here that may apply to other airports, and there's a sense that the airlines, all of the airlines, are a little nervous about the escalating cost because of what it might mean for their participation in other terminal projects in other cities across the country, and so they're paying very close attention to how the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted in this particular what's called a use agreement, and the term sheet that goes with it that will be a part of the final development agreement.
But we heard the name Burns & McDonnell, which really competed for this at the beginning, now being brought up, asked to price out. Is it possible that we could see them come back to the table at this point?
Well, the exclusivity clause with Edgemoor ran out in September, so now that whole thing is kind of like a quick note scribbled on the back of your homework, passed 3 people over, hoping that it makes it to where it's supposed to go. And when you're looking, I just want to say, when you're looking at Spirit and Allegiant and these kind of lower cost airlines, that's who people fly last minute. That's who they get on when they need to go somewhere. So if you don't have the support of those airlines and there's some concern for Midwest flyers not being able to get places quickly and cheaply, that could stall things too.
The mayor, though, shutting down the talk about Burns & McDonnell, saying, no, we are working with Edgemoor, that's the way it is.
Yes, he was very upset yesterday in his comments, but he says we're working with Edgemoor, but the agreement hasn't been signed, so nothing is set in stone. And there are some council members, I think, who are wondering, is it possible that this can be done for cheaper?
Yeah. There are some issues you hope that you don't have to keep going on and on. We talked about it last week. I mean, are we still going to be talking about this agreement into next year, Dave?
Well, we thought when the memorandum of understanding was agreed to in February that the hard work was over. We were wrong, of course, and Burns & McDonnell has, since that time, circled the airport and said, in essence, to council members, we're always here if you decide you want to make another choice. It would be extraordinarily messy if that decision were made now. There would be lawsuits, delays. I mean, it would be a very, very difficult political decision for the council to make to, in essence, change direction now. The agreement that's now on the table with Edgemoor is nearly 600 pages long. It's been worked on for some time. It's very specific. If the decision is made to sort of reverse gears now, Nick, it would be just about the biggest political mess I've seen in Kansas City in 25 years.
Yeah, we are in a political cycle. We can't forget that mayoral race is about to turn the corner and heat up, and you're going to see this come onto the plate.
There were some concerns that Burns & McDonnell might be funding certain candidates, yes, and that might help to change that decision.
On the basis of what happens at the airport, and what we tried to write in an editorial this week is, you ought to back away. I think this problem with the airlines can and will be solved. I think they'll start turning dirt before the end of the year out at the airport.
I do want to point out, if for some reason the city decided to walk away, they do still have to reimburse Edgemoor for the out-of-pocket costs. So there is a cost associated with walking away at this point.
And uncertainty over KCI is affecting decision-making on a lot of other hot-button issues in Kansas City. Remember those plans to rename the Paseo after Dr. Martin Luther King? Still no decision on that. But a compromise reached this week to keep the Paseo name as well as honoring Dr. King. It may take a little more metal to build the sign, but how does Martin Luther King Jr. on the Paseo sound? How is that going down, Toriano?
I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. I'm a big believer in you either do it or you don't. And there are the group of ministers that came out with this proposal years ago. They had a great plan in place for the Paseo, and I remain a proponent of the Paseo being renamed.
But it's been hard to get agreement. Is this a suitable compromise for at least a majority of the council?
I don't know if this will be enough for a lot of council members. I will point out that there was another name brought up, so it's either that or Catherine Shields brought up Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Paseo. So I think that there are a lot of people who feel it's just not enough, that Martin Luther King deserves his own. Also, it's a mouthful. Okay? It's a mouthful.
I'm enjoying seeing Caroline Sweeney's perplexed look that you didn't see on camera.
It blows me away that we're bending over backwards to try to make this compromise when the city council's been talking about this for so long. It's been a discussion in the city for so long. This just needs to end.
There's lots of topics, though, that are continually brought up. No votes are taken. Also, this week, the Kansas City Council was expected to decide once and for all a panhandler ordinance that would effectively ban anyone from standing at street corners or exit ramps longer than the time it takes to safely cross the street. Was a decision reached on that?
Nope. It was held again. Will it ever see the light of day? I'm not sure.
It's unconstitutional. That's the bottom line. It's unconstitutional.
We also have some people complaining, of course, that these ordinances, like these ones, amount to a war on the poor. Yes. And it's not the only measure upsetting those who work with low-income residents. The Kansas City Health Department trying to defend itself after dumping hundreds of pounds of food intended for the homeless.
There was kids that needed food. And they had to sit there and watch people throw it away right in front of them.
Did people standing in line awaiting a hot meal expect to get bleach instead? More accurately, see city health inspectors dump the food into large bags, pour bleach on top of it to make sure no one tried to eat it. The food was provided by a volunteer program called Free Hot Soup. What is the city so concerned about, Toriano?
Disease and the spread of disease. Because if you don't have a food handler's card and you're handling food, you could be sick, pass that on, you pass it on to a homeless population, it spreads. That's a concern.
Caroline.
The KCTV5 News investigative team has been working on this for several days now, and we did just hear that the city is going to kind of change things a little bit. What they're going to do is they're going to get a van, and if they see an issue with food, like the food that was being given out at Free Hot Soup, they're going to take it and they're going to dispose of it somewhere else. So they're not going to pour bleach on food in front of people who need the food. They're going to dispose of it elsewhere.
It was the bleach word, I think, that really set people off. If just dumping food is one thing, bleaching the other. But you were out there to see how things have changed. Did you notice a difference in how it was handled?
Well, I did notice a difference this past Sunday because, well, it was a holiday weekend. The health department did not come out. The folks at the downtown park in Kansas City did end up handing out a lot of pre-packaged food instead of the warm homemade food they were making before. Some people have suggested that this is the health department backing down on this issue. I would point out that is not the case. There was an FAQ posted on their website that says if this continues, if these home cooked meals are served, they will start to issue court summons to these volunteers.
And they really... You know, I talked to Rex Archer about this. We wrote an editorial. I talked to the Free Hot Soup people. The health department really doesn't have a good deal of choice here, Nick, because it's responsible for sort of supervising restaurants and other soup kitchens around the community. And if they create an exception that's not in the ordinance for Free Hot Soup, the others are going to step forward and say, well, why do we need food handlers?
But
why do we
one of the differences is they say they're not a charitable group. They're a bunch of friends coming together on Facebook. So it's much like a picnic and is a difference than having an organized group. Is that true?
Well, that's the argument. Now, whether the health department buys it or not is another question. And there's also a suggestion that what's really behind this is that neighbors are upset with these events in parks. They think too many homeless are showing up and that the health department intervention was just an excuse. That's a political matter that needs to be addressed too.
Toriano.
Yeah, I thought the bleach was a little heavy-handed, but in the same token, regulation is very much needed in situations like that.
And we have seen stories, for instance, of people who are even homeless file suit against cities if they break a tooth relating to food like this. So those are realistic legal expectations and consequences.
Can I just say quickly, it's just wrong to say, well, they're homeless, so they don't get food, so they should have to go with food that potentially, anyway, has a problem. So there has to be some framework for it. I think both sides want to compromise.
We spend a lot of time in the news business tackling problems, conflicts, negative life experiences. What about what's good in Kansas City? As we head into Thanksgiving, what was the biggest good news story of the week that we can be grateful for? Was it the first full week uninterrupted by campaign commercials? Liberty Memorial making national news as the world marks the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. While construction is stalled at the airport, we are still getting things done. Construction gets underway on a project 7 years in the making, a new downtown YMCA. And a team that keeps on winning. And now its most celebrated star making his debut on the front cover of Sports Illustrated. All panelists, was it something completely different? Kat Reed.
This is going to be a controversial one, but I'm going to say the snow was the good news story of the week, because there's something about the first major snowfall of the year that gets people, it's kind of like a childlike reaction to it.
Kat Reed. Caroline Sweeney.
Mine is actually not a news story, but mine's what's coming up. I'm so ready for the Plaza Lights. To me, that is what makes the holiday season here in Kansas City.
Even though it's Sly James and not Patrick Holmes who will be turning on the lights this year.
You know what? I like Patrick Mahomes, but I think Sly James can flip this way.
Alrighty then, Toriana Porter.
It's a good news week anytime I'm able to come out and hang out with you guys.
Oh, that is incredible. Thank you, Dave
exactly
Helling.
Right, and I feel like a grandpa on this set, I must say, very quickly. But no, the good news story for me this week was, and Kat had this, a bit of this story last night, was the East Side continues to show green shoots. The East Side sales tax is getting squared away. The East Side plan passed at the City Council. Housing is back on the agenda. I just think that we may be on the verge again of solving a huge problem in Kansas City, or at least addressing it as it should be addressed.
And I'm feeling like a giddy schoolboy on this set. Thank you, everyone. Have a great Thanksgiving.